The letter arrived on a Tuesday. Dorothea Crane read it twice, then let out a laugh so sharp it turned heads across the post office. "Well," she said, loud enough for everyone to hear, "looks like Caleb Ashcroft finally found himself a wife." She held the envelope up like evidence at a trial. A mail-order one, because apparently that's the only kind that would have him. The room chuckled, but Dorothea wasn't finished. "Says here she's coming from Millfield." She folded the letter with a satisfied snap. "Let's just hope she knows what she's walking into. A cold man, a cold house, and a town that'll eat her alive." Nobody corrected her. Nobody ever did. And that was exactly how the worst story in Harlan Creek began. If this kind of story speaks to your heart, the kind where the underdog rises and the cruel ones finally face what's coming, subscribe to this channel right now. Hit that like button and drop your city and country in the comments below. I want to know how far this story has traveled. Now stay with me, because what happens next will make your blood boil and your heart ache, and I promise you, it is absolutely worth every minute. The stagecoach rolled into Harlan Creek on a Wednesday morning in late October, trailing dust and the smell of horses pushed too hard for too many miles. It wasn't a gentle arrival. The wheels hit a rut on Main Street and the whole carriage lurched sideways, and the woman inside grabbed the leather strap above the window just to keep herself from sliding off the bench entirely. Rosalie Mercer had been traveling for 4 days. She hadn't slept properly in any of them. She pressed her face close to the smudged window glass and looked out at the town that was supposed to be her new home, and what she felt wasn't hope or excitement or even curiosity. What she felt was the particular kind of tired that lives deeper than bones. The tired that comes from carrying too much weight for too many years, and not the kind of weight people could see. Well, some of it they could see. She knew that. She had always known that. Rosalie was a large woman. She had been a large girl before that, and before that, a large child who learned early that the world was not built with her comfort in mind. Not chairs, not doorways, not the eyes of strangers who felt entitled to stare. She had a round face that might have been called pretty under different circumstances, dark eyes that missed nothing, and hands that were rough and capable from years of work. She was 31 years old and had spent most of those years being either invisible or too visible, depending on who was in the room. She carried one bag. Everything she owned was in it. Her brother Gerald had been very clear about what she was allowed to take. "You're not a guest leaving on vacation, Rosalie. You're a burden being relocated." That's what he'd said, standing in the doorway of the room she'd lived in for 6 years in his house, the room she'd cleaned and cooked for and bled herself dry to justify. He'd said it without cruelty in his voice, which was somehow worse than if he'd been angry. Anger she could have pushed against. That flat, bored certainty. That was the kind of thing that stuck in the ribs. She hadn't argued. She'd packed the bag. The stagecoach stopped in front of the general store, and the driver climbed down and opened the door, and Rosalie stepped out onto the packed dirt of Harlan Creek's main street. She straightened her coat, smoothed the front of her dress, dark blue, practical, nothing fancy, and looked around. A handful of people had stopped to watch. Not because stagecoaches were unusual, because she was. She could feel it already, the way eyes moved over her and then exchanged glances with other eyes. She'd lived in that particular language her whole life. She understood every word of it. A boy of maybe 12 nudged another boy beside him. She heard the word big and then laughter, quickly hushed by a woman nearby who looked embarrassed, not for Rosalie, but for the scene. Rosalie lifted her chin and looked straight ahead. "You have survived worse," she told herself. "You have survived worse than this." She scanned the street for the man she was supposed to meet. The advertisement had been brief and direct. She'd read it so many times the paper had gone soft at the folds. "Ranch owner seeks capable woman for practical arrangement. Work and shelter provided. No expectations beyond honest labor. Reply to C. Ashcroft, Harlan Creek." There had been one letter exchanged after that, short and businesslike, and in it he had told her what day to arrive and nothing else. She didn't know what he looked like. She only knew his name. "Miss Mercer." The voice came from her left. Not a question. A statement, flat and certain, like he already knew she was the right person and wasn't particularly pleased about confirming it. She turned. Caleb Ashcroft was leaning against the post outside the general store with his arms crossed and his hat pulled low. He was tall and lean in the way of men who worked outdoors and didn't eat enough, weathered in a way that made his age hard to pin. Somewhere in his late 30s, she guessed, though the set of his jaw made him look older. He had light eyes, gray-green, the color of late November sky just before a cold front rolls in. He wasn't looking at her the way the others were. He wasn't looking at her like a problem or a spectacle. He was looking at her like a transaction he needed to complete. "That's me," she said. He pushed off from the post and picked up her bag before she could protest. "Wagon's out back. We leave in 10 minutes. That was it. No handshake. No welcome. No, "How was the journey?" or "Are you hungry?" or any of the small human courtesies that cost nothing and mean everything. Just 10 minutes, and the wagon's out back. Rosalie followed him because there was nowhere else to go. She heard one of the women on the street murmur something as she passed. She caught only the tail end of it, "Poor man," and felt something harden in her chest like a fist closing around a stone. Poor man. As if he were the one who deserved pity. She didn't say anything. She got in the wagon. The ride to the ranch took 40 minutes on a road that couldn't decide whether it was a road or a dry riverbed. Caleb drove without speaking. Rosalie sat beside him and didn't push for conversation. She'd learned long ago that silence wasn't always hostility. Sometimes it was just the absence of pretending. But after 20 minutes, she needed to know something. "Mr. Ashcroft." He didn't look at her. "Caleb's fine." "Caleb?" She folded her hands in her lap. "I want to be clear about something before we get there." He said nothing, which she took as permission to continue. "I'm not here because I had many options," she said. "I'm here because the one I had was this. And I'll work hard. I'll do whatever needs doing on that ranch, and I won't complain and I won't make demands. But I need to know—" She stopped. Started again. "I need to know if there are rules I should understand. Things you expect. Ways I shouldn't behave." She paused. "I find it easier to fail rules I know about than rules someone keeps secret." He was quiet for long enough that she thought he wasn't going to answer. Then he said, "Don't touch my desk. Don't go into the room at the end of the hall. Don't try to make this into something it isn't." "What is it?" "An arrangement." "I know that," she said. "I'm not confused about what this is." Something shifted in his jaw. Not quite a reaction, but the absence of one that surprised her. Like he'd expected pushback and she'd refused to give it. "Then we'll get along fine," he said. She looked out at the flat land spreading in every direction, the dry grass and the occasional fence post, the sky so enormous it made her feel like she'd been set down in the middle of a sentence she didn't know how to finish. "We'll get along fine." She'd been told that before, by people who had no intention of making it true. The ranch was in worse shape than she'd expected. Not ruined, the bones of it were solid, the structure sound, but neglected in the way that things get when someone stops caring enough to maintain them. The porch railing was loose at one end. The garden was overgrown to the point of being architectural. A section of the fence near the barn leaned at an angle that suggested it had given up and was simply waiting to be officially released from its duties. Rosalie walked through the front door and looked around the kitchen. The stove was good. The pantry was half stocked. The table had 3 chairs, 2 matching, one that clearly came from somewhere else. And the window over the sink looked out onto the back field, where a handful of cattle moved slow and indifferent in the late afternoon light. It wasn't pretty, but it was workable. "Your room is at the end on the right," Caleb said behind her. "Supper's usually at 6. I don't expect you to cook until you've had a day to settle." "I'll cook tonight," she said. He made a sound that wasn't quite objection and wasn't quite acceptance. "Fine. I'll be in the barn." He left. Rosalie stood alone in the kitchen for a moment. She let herself feel the weight of it, the strangeness, the loneliness, the specific ache of being 31 years old and starting completely over in a place that didn't want you with a man who'd made it clear he didn't intend to want you either. She felt all of it. And then she put it away the way she always put things away, in that deep interior drawer where she kept everything that didn't have a solution. She found an apron hanging behind the pantry door and put it on. She built a fire in the stove. She started looking for what she had to work with. She made rabbit stew from the 2 dressed rabbits she found hanging in the cold room off the back of the kitchen, with dried beans and onion and what turned out to be a very decent spice collection for a man who allegedly did not care about food. She made cornbread from scratch in the cast iron pan she found behind the stove. She set the table with 2 plates and 2 cups and sat down when Caleb came in from the barn at 6:10, smelling of horses and cold air. He stopped when he saw the table. Then he sat down. He ate without speaking for a while. She ate too. The stew was good. She knew it was good, not from pride, but from the plain fact that she'd been cooking since she was 8 years old, and she knew what good food tasted like. After a few minutes, he said, "You can cook." "Yes." "Who taught you?" "Myself, mostly. My mother some, before she passed." She broke off a piece of cornbread. "You have a good spice shelf for someone who doesn't seem to eat much." "My mother," he said. Then, as if that had required more personal disclosure than he'd intended, "She passed a long time ago." "I'm sorry." He nodded. Once. The conversation closed like a door, but it had opened, even briefly, and Rosalie filed that away too. Not in the drawer where she kept the painful things, but in a different one, the drawer where she kept things worth remembering. 2 weeks passed. In that time, Rosalie repaired the porch railing with tools she found in the barn and instructions she figured out herself through 3 failed attempts. She cleared a section of the garden and planted the winter greens she'd found seeds for in a tin on the pantry shelf, labeled in handwriting that wasn't Caleb's, smaller, rounder, a woman's writing. She didn't ask about it. She patched a section of the fence with Caleb's ranch hand, a quiet older man named Delbert, who accepted her presence with the equanimity of someone who had seen too much to waste surprise on anything. She also started learning the cattle operation, not because Caleb invited her to, but because she watched and asked Delbert questions when Caleb wasn't around, and read the 3 battered record books she found in the barn office. Caleb noticed. He didn't say anything about it, but she caught him watching her sometimes from across the yard with an expression she couldn't read. Not unfriendly, not warm, somewhere in the middle where most honest feelings tend to live. The town was a different matter. She went in with Caleb on a Friday to collect supplies, and the experience was instructive. She understood within the first 10 minutes that Harlan Creek had already decided who she was. She saw it in the way conversation paused when she entered the general store and resumed at a slightly different pitch after she passed. She saw it in the particular smile of the woman at the counter. Margaret, someone called her. The kind of smile that exists in the same expression as a sneer, dressed up in politeness so thin you could see right through it. "So you're the one," Margaret said, setting a sack of flour on the counter. "I'm Rosalie Ashcroft," she said. She'd used the name for the first time that morning, and it felt strange in her mouth. Not wrong, just unfamiliar, like a word in a language she was still learning. Margaret's eyes moved over her in that way. "You've got your work cut out for you, I imagine. Caleb Ashcroft has been a closed door for as long as anyone can remember." "I'm not trying to open it," Rosalie said. "I'm just trying to do my job." Margaret's smile tightened slightly. "Of course you are, dear." Dear. The particular weaponization of a term of affection. Rosalie added the flour to her list and moved on. Outside, she found Caleb talking to 2 men near the wagon. She heard her own name and then a pause when she walked up, the kind of pause that meant they'd been saying something they weren't going to say in front of her. One of the men, heavy-set, red-faced, wearing a grin that didn't touch his eyes, looked at her and then at Caleb and said, "Well, Caleb, she'll certainly keep the house warm in winter." The other man laughed. Caleb's expression didn't change. He picked up a crate from the wagon bed and handed it to Rosalie without looking at her and said simply, "We're done here. Let's go." It wasn't a defense, she knew that. He hadn't told the man to shut his mouth. He'd just removed them from the situation. But he'd also felt it, she thought. She'd seen something in his jaw when the man laughed, something that wasn't quite nothing. She put the crate in the wagon and climbed up. 3 weeks in, Gerald arrived. She heard the horse before she saw him, because she was in the garden and the sound came from the road, moving fast and not particularly careful. She stood up and brushed the soil from her hands and watched her brother ride into the yard like a man who owned the place. Gerald always rode like he owned whatever place he was in, even when he demonstrably did not. He swung off the horse and looked at her with that expression she'd memorized, the one that combined impatience with a kind of permanent disappointment, like she was a problem that kept failing to solve itself. "You look healthy enough," he said. Not warmly, more like checking the condition of something he'd lent out. "I am," she said. "What do you want, Gerald?" He put a hand to his chest like she'd wounded him. "Can a man visit his sister?" "You never have before." He dropped the performance. "I need $50. There it was. "I don't have $50. "You're married to a rancher, Rosalie. There's money here." "There's Caleb's money," she said. "I won't ask him for it." Gerald's eyes hardened. He stepped closer, and she didn't step back. But she registered the familiar tension in her shoulders. The old reflex, the one built from years of knowing that Gerald's voice went cold before Gerald's hands did anything. And the coldness was its own kind of blow. "You listen to me," he said, low. "I brought you here. I arranged this. You'd be back in my spare room sleeping on that cot if it wasn't for me making a call and sending a letter, and I am asking you for a simple, 'What is going on out here?'" Caleb's voice came from behind her. Flat, not loud. The kind of voice that didn't need to be loud. Gerald straightened. His eyes moved from Rosalie to Caleb with the instinctive recalibration of a man who had just identified a more significant threat. "Just visiting my sister," Gerald said. "She doesn't look like she's enjoying the visit." Gerald smiled, that wide, shallow smile of his. "Family business, friend. Nothing that needs to concern—" "This is my property," Caleb said. He walked to stand beside Rosalie, not in front of her, not behind her, beside her, which she noticed. "Which makes anything that happens on it my concern. Say what you came to say and leave." Gerald's smile didn't waver, but something behind it did. "I was just discussing a small financial matter with my sister." "She said no," Caleb said. "You're done. Now listen here, I don't think you understand. You came here to take money from her." Caleb's voice hadn't changed in volume or temperature, but something in it had shifted into a register that made Rosalie very still. "She said no. I'm saying get off my land. She's my sister. She's my wife." The words landed like stones in still water. "And you treated her like a debt you were relieved to discharge. I know exactly what you are. So I'll say it one more time, and after that I'm done with words." He held Gerald's gaze. "Get off my land." Gerald looked at Rosalie. She looked back at him and didn't offer him anything. Not rescue, not apology, not the usual reflexive softening she'd spent 31 years performing. He left. He rode out hard, the way he'd ridden in. She and Caleb stood there for a moment, side by side, watching the road. "Thank you," she said. He said nothing. He walked back toward the barn, but he'd stood beside her. She kept coming back to that. Not in front of her, like she needed protecting. Not behind her, like she was a problem to manage. Beside her, like they were the same kind of thing. The fourth week brought the first real frost of the season, and with it, a particular kind of ache in the old boards of the farmhouse that Rosalie recognized as the building telling you it was cold, even in the places you couldn't see. She woke up early and built the fire in the kitchen stove before Caleb was up, because it mattered to her that he walked into a warm kitchen, even if she couldn't have explained exactly why. She was pouring coffee when he came in, and he stopped for just a moment, just a fraction of a second, at the warmth of the room. "Frost's heavy," she said. "I know." He sat down and wrapped both hands around the cup. "Need to check the water troughs before the cattle come in." "I'll go." He looked up. "I know where they are," she said. "I've been going out with Delbert in the mornings, and you've got the books to finish before you go to Harlan Creek this afternoon." She met his eyes. "I'm not asking. I'm telling you it makes more sense." He held her gaze for a long moment. Something moved behind his eyes. Surprise, maybe, or the thing that comes just after surprise when you realize you're not going to argue because the other person is simply right. "Take the heavy gloves," he said. "There are a pair on the hook in the barn." She nodded. She finished her coffee and put on her coat. "Rosalie." She turned. He was looking at his hands around the cup. "The garden," he said. "The winter greens." He stopped, started again. "They look good. It wasn't a grand statement, it wasn't poetry, but from Caleb Ashcroft, who handed out personal words the way a man hands out his last match in a windstorm, carefully, reluctantly, only when the situation truly demands it. It was something. She pulled on her coat. "I'll have them ready to harvest in 3 weeks," she said, "if the frost doesn't go too deep." She walked out into the cold morning, and she was doing something she didn't do very often. She was almost smiling. Part 2. What grows in cold ground. The winter greens came in exactly 3 weeks later, just like Rosalie had said they would. She pulled the first harvest on a Saturday morning when the ground was iron hard and the air had that particular bite that gets into your lungs and reminds you that the body is a temporary arrangement. She carried the basket in through the back door, set it on the kitchen table, and stood there for a moment just looking at it. The dark leaves, the compact heads, the proof that something she had put into the ground had decided to stay. Caleb came in from the barn and stopped when he saw the basket. "That's a good yield," he said. "Better than I expected, actually." She pulled off her gloves. "The soil's decent once you get past the top layer. Whoever worked this garden before knew what they were doing." He didn't respond to that. He poured himself coffee and stood at the window and looked out at the field, and she let him have his silence because she'd learned by now that Caleb's silences weren't all the same. Some of them were closed doors. Some of them were just him thinking, working something through, the way a man does when he's spent so many years alone that the inside of his head became the loudest room in the house. This one felt like the second kind. "There were more cattle then," he said finally, "when the garden was kept up properly. More hands, more—" He stopped. "More going on around here." She didn't push. She started washing the greens in the basin. After a moment, he said, "I'll be in town Thursday. You need anything, write it down." "I'll come with you." He turned from the window. "You don't have to." "I know I don't have to." She kept her back to him, working the leaves under the water. "But Delbert mentioned the Henderson farm has a draft mare they're looking to sell, and I'd like to see her before someone else does. We need another animal if we're going to work the north field in spring." She could feel him staring at the back of her head. "You've been thinking about the north field," he said, "since the second week." She turned around and met his eyes, her hands still wet. "The soil there is different, harder, more clay. But if you turn it right in early spring before it dries out, and you plant it with the right crop rotation, it could give you 30% more yield by summer. Maybe more." He was quiet for a long moment. "Where did you learn that?" "Books, mostly, and watching." She dried her hands on a cloth. "My father had a small farm before things went wrong. I paid attention." Caleb set his cup down on the counter. He looked at her with that unreadable expression she'd filed away in the drawer of things worth remembering. Not cold, not warm, something in between that was somehow more honest than either. "I'll let Henderson know we're coming," he said. That was all. But it was enough. Thursday arrived gray and reluctant, the sky the color of old pewter, and they rode into Harlan Creek side by side on the wagon seat with 6 inches of space between them that felt like a carefully maintained agreement. The town looked different to Rosalie now than it had on that first day. Not friendlier, but more legible. She knew which storefronts mattered, which faces belonged to which names, which smiles were real, and which were the social equivalent of a locked gate with a welcome sign nailed to it. She knew, for instance, that the woman crossing the street toward them right now was Dorothea Crane. She'd heard the name from Delbert, who had delivered it the way you deliver a weather warning. Matter of fact, without drama, but with the clear implication that you ought to take it seriously. "Dorothea Crane runs the ladies' auxiliary, and about half the social machinery in this town," he'd said. "She doesn't like things she didn't arrange herself." Dorothea was a handsome woman in her 50s, silver-haired, dressed with the particular care of someone who wanted you to know that their appearance was a choice and not an accident. She had sharp eyes and a warm public smile that Rosalie recognized instantly as a performance, because she'd grown up watching her brother perform the same way. "Caleb," Dorothea said, stopping beside the wagon. She looked up at him and then, with the practiced casualness of a woman adjusting the scope of a rifle, at Rosalie. "And this must be Mrs. Ashcroft. We've been looking forward to meeting you properly." "Have you?" Rosalie said. If the flatness of it landed, Dorothea didn't let it show. "I do hope you're settling in. Ranch life can be quite an adjustment for someone who isn't accustomed to it. The pause before accustomed was surgical. Rosalie understood exactly what had been said and exactly what hadn't been said, and she kept her face easy and her voice even and said, "I'm adjusting fine, thank you." "Wonderful." Dorothea's smile shifted by maybe a single degree. The adjustment of someone recalibrating. "We have a ladies' gathering next month. Nothing formal, just coffee and good company. I do hope you'll join us." "I'll think about it," Rosalie said. Caleb had said nothing through any of this. He'd held the reins and looked straight ahead with the expression of a man who has learned that some conversations are best observed from a distance. When Dorothea said her goodbyes and moved on, Rosalie watched her go and felt something settle in her chest. Not fear exactly, but the recognition of a particular kind of opponent. "Don't go to that gathering," Caleb said quietly. "I know," she said. They didn't discuss it further. The wagon rolled on. The mare at Henderson's farm was a gray roan with a white blaze and the kind of disposition that announced itself immediately. She let Rosalie approach with her ears forward and her head steady, and when Rosalie put a hand on her neck, the animal leaned into it slightly, which told her everything she needed to know. "She's sound," Rosalie said. "How old?" Old Henderson, actually named Henderson, first name Warren, a man of about 70 who moved like someone renegotiating with gravity, said, 7. No vices. My boy broke her 3 years ago, and she's been a good worker, but we've got too many animals for the winter feed we've put up." "What do you want for her?" Warren named a price. Rosalie said nothing for a moment. She checked the mare's hooves one by one, looking at each with the deliberate attention of someone who knows exactly what they're looking for and isn't in a hurry to pretend otherwise. "Her left front is a little long," she said. "She's due for the farrier." "She is," Warren admitted. "I'll give you 3/4 of what you asked, and we'll call the farrier bill our problem." Warren looked at Caleb, who had been standing by the fence this whole time, with his hat in his hands, and an expression Rosalie couldn't see. Warren seemed to be looking for permission or confirmation or something masculine he expected to find there. Caleb just said, "She knows horses." Warren looked back at Rosalie, and something in his old face shifted toward what might have been respect. "Deal," he said. They shook hands. Rosalie's grip was firm, and Warren's was too, and neither of them felt the need to make it into something bigger than it was. On the way home, with the mare tied to the back of the wagon and the gray sky deepening toward evening, Caleb said, "You negotiated him down 20%. 22, she said. He made a sound that wasn't quite a laugh. She'd never heard him make that sound before. It was brief and quiet and disappeared almost as soon as it arrived, but she caught it, turned it over, put it in the drawer. The mare's name became Pearl, which was Rosalie's decision, and Caleb didn't argue. Pearl went into the barn and took up residence with the calm authority of an animal that understands its own value, and within 2 days Delbert was talking to her while he worked, which Rosalie considered a sign of excellent character in both parties. December came in hard. The temperature dropped and the wind picked up, and the ranch settled into the rhythms of hard weather management. Livestock fed early, water troughs checked twice a day. The smaller repairs that couldn't wait pushed through before the cold made them impossible. Rosalie worked alongside Delbert and increasingly alongside Caleb himself, who had begun appearing in the places where she was working with the gradual naturalness of someone who kept ending up somewhere by accident until they had to admit it wasn't an accident. He didn't say much during these parallel stretches of work. Neither did she, most of the time. But the silence between them had changed in character. It had lost the formal quality of the early weeks, that careful, contractual quiet of two strangers who have agreed on terms and are committed to honoring them. What replaced it was harder to name. It wasn't warmth exactly. It was more like the recognition of shared effort, the way people who work toward the same thing develop a language made of gestures and timing that doesn't require words. She handed him the wrench before he asked for it. He moved the feed sack out of her path without being asked to. Small things, the kind of small things that are invisible to everyone except the two people doing them. One evening in mid-December, she came in from the barn later than usual. a problem with Pearl's water that had taken longer than expected, and found that Caleb had put a pot on the stove. It wasn't sophisticated. It was beans and salt pork, and it had been stirred approximately twice, and it was a little too salty and the beans were a little underdone. But it was on the stove when she came in cold and tired, and he was sitting at the table with his own bowl already, and there was a second bowl waiting. She sat down. She ate it. "It's salty," she said. "I know." "The beans need another 10 minutes." "I know." She ate more of it. "It's good," she said. Because despite its technical deficiencies, it was good. The kind of good that comes from something being there when you need it, prepared by someone who decided that mattered. He said nothing, but he ate his whole bowl, and she ate hers, and the fire in the stove popped and settled, and neither of them felt the particular weight of the silence, which told Rosalie something she wasn't entirely ready to examine. The thing about a small town is that it is always watching, always cataloging, always finding meaning in the inventory. People had watched Caleb Ashcroft for years. The cold rancher, the closed man, the one who had shut himself down after whatever had happened with the woman whose name nobody said directly, but everybody knew. They had built a whole understanding of him around his distance, the way you build a map around a space marked unknown and fill it in with assumptions. He was the man who didn't need anyone. That was the story. That was what Harlan Creek had decided. And now there was a woman living in his house who was, by every report that filtered back through the social machinery of the town, not only surviving but apparently working, repairing things, improving things, going to Henderson's and negotiating a horse purchase as if she had every right to, which somehow irritated people more than if she'd been incompetent. Incompetence would have confirmed what they expected. Competence was a problem. Dorothea Crane held a small coffee at her house in mid-December, the kind of event that was nominally about warmth and community and in practice was about information. 4 women sat in her front parlor and reported what they had observed. Margaret from the general store. Rosalie Ashcroft came in twice this month and spent more carefully than the Ashcroft account had been managed in years. She'd asked about the wholesale price of seed for spring planting. She'd been polite and hadn't given anyone anything to grab onto. Ruth Bellamy, whose husband shared fence line with the Ashcroft ranch, she'd seen Caleb and Rosalie working together in the south pasture last Tuesday, not side by side like strangers, like people who had done it before. Clara Hobbs, whose opinion nobody particularly valued but who was there anyway, she thought the woman seemed decent enough and maybe they should leave well enough alone. Clara Hobbs had been wrong about things before. The room moved on. "The question," Dorothea said, stirring her coffee with the measured calm of a woman who does not stir coffee, she stirs situations, "is whether we allow the narrative to get away from us." "What narrative?" Ruth asked. Dorothea looked at her. "The one where the mail-order bride nobody wanted turns out to be exactly what that ranch needed. The one where Caleb Ashcroft thaws out, and everybody in this town has to reconsider what they said about him." She set her spoon down. "The one where we look like fools." Nobody said anything. "There's a community dinner in January," Dorothea said. "I think we should make sure Mrs. Ashcroft feels properly welcomed." The way she said welcomed left no ambiguity about what she meant. Rosalie knew none of this and wouldn't have changed her behavior if she had. She was not a woman who managed herself around the threat of other people's opinions. She had tried that approach for 31 years and it had gotten her exactly nowhere. Only Gerald and a cot in a spare room and a feeling like permanent apology. She did not live apologetically. That was the thing nobody in Harlan Creek quite understood about her yet. What she did in the days leading to Christmas was continue. She worked the ranch. She kept the books. Caleb had found her doing this one evening, had stood in the office doorway with something that might have been alarm, and she'd said, "Your February projections are off because you didn't account for the fee increase on grain supply. I fixed it." And he had looked at the ledger and not argued. She mended clothes, her own, and after a week of watching him wear a shirt with a tear at the shoulder seam that clearly irritated him, his as well, leaving the repaired shirt folded on the table without comment. He didn't say anything about that either, but the shirt was gone from the table by morning. Christmas Eve came quiet and cold. Delbert had gone to his daughter's place in the next county for the week, and the ranch was still in the way that places get when they hold only 2 people and a lot of empty sky. Rosalie had cooked more than usual. A proper roast, the good potatoes, a dried apple cake that had required more effort than she intended to admit. She set the table with the better dishes she'd found in the back of the cabinet, the ones with the faded blue rim that matched the tin on the pantry shelf where the winter seeds had been. Caleb came in from checking on the animals and stopped in the kitchen doorway. He looked at the table and then at her. "You didn't have to do all this," he said. "I know," she said. "Sit down." He sat. She served the food and sat across from him, and they ate the best meal either of them had had in months, possibly years. The roast was good. The potatoes were better. The cake turned out slightly dense, which she mentioned, and he said it was fine, and it was fine, and they ate almost all of it. At some point during the meal, he said, without any particular preamble, "Why did you answer the advertisement?" She looked up from her plate. "You know why." "I know the circumstance," he said. "Your brother, the situation. That's the why of the timing. I'm asking about the why of the choice." He held her gaze, which he rarely did for this long. "There were other options, probably. Women in your situation. There were other ways." She was quiet for a moment. "There were other ways," she said. "Women who would have taken me on as household help. Women like that exist, and they're kind, and it's honest work." She turned her fork in her hand. "But I would have been help. Someone's extra set of hands, something useful that lives in the back room." She looked at him. This advertisement said practical arrangement. It said work in exchange for shelter. It said nothing about being grateful or appropriate or taking up the right amount of space. She paused. It read like something written by a person who was honest about what they had to offer and didn't dress it up. I respected that. He was quiet. "And I thought," she said, slower now, "that a man who was honest about having nothing to offer might at least not resent me for not pretending he did." Something moved across his face. A complicated thing. Not pain exactly, but the expression of a person recognizing the outline of their own life in someone else's description of it. "That's a very clear way of seeing it," he said. "I've had time to think it through." He looked at his plate, then at the cake, then at her. "It's not dense," he said. "The cake." She laughed. It came out of her before she could manage it. Real, unguarded, the kind of laugh she hadn't had in a long time. It startled her slightly, that it was still there. He didn't laugh, but the corner of his mouth moved, just barely. She thought about that corner of his mouth for a long time after she went to bed. January came in with a particular cruelty that felt personal, the kind of cold that doesn't just sit on the surface but pushes into the walls and the floorboards and makes the house creak all night like it's arguing with itself. Rosalie woke before dawn most mornings and built the fire before anything else. And this had become such a fixed part of the household rhythm that Caleb had started leaving kindling split and stacked beside the stove the night before, without a word about it, without any ceremony. She noticed everything. She just didn't always mention it. The community dinner was announced on a Saturday, posted outside the church hall and the general store. Annual community winter gathering, January 19th, all welcome. Rosalie saw the notice when she went in for supplies and felt the particular awareness of something significant in neutral language. All welcome was rarely as indiscriminate as it sounded. She didn't mention it to Caleb that day. She went home and made supper and thought about it while she worked, turning it over the way she turned soil, looking at what was underneath, feeling for the texture of what she was actually dealing with. That evening, Caleb was at the desk in the office when she appeared in the doorway. He looked up. "The community dinner," she said. "Are you planning to go?" He set his pen down. "I usually do. It's expected." "Then I'll go with you." He held her gaze. "You don't have to." "Caleb." She leaned against the doorframe. "I know what Dorothea Crane is. I've known women like her my entire life. And I know that if I don't show up, that becomes its own statement, that I'm ashamed to be seen or afraid, or that whatever they think of me is accurate enough to keep me home." She kept her voice level. "I won't give them that." He was silent for a moment. "It could be unpleasant. Most things worth doing are." He picked up his pen again. He didn't say anything else, but the line of his shoulders had changed. Some small tension in them that she hadn't noticed was there until it wasn't. as if something had been confirmed for him that he hadn't known he was waiting for. She went back to the kitchen. She put the kettle on for tea. Outside, the wind pushed at the windows with that January insistence, and the house groaned and held, and Pearl made a sound in the barn that might have been contentment or complaint. From that distance, it was hard to tell the difference. Rosalie poured her tea and sat at the kitchen table alone and thought about what January 19th was going to look like. And she felt the familiar weight of the things she'd been carrying her whole life, the knowledge that she would always, at some point, have to walk into a room knowing that room had already decided what to do with her. She had walked into those rooms before. She had not always walked out of them undamaged, but she had always walked out. She drank her tea and went to bed and slept solidly, the way people do when they've stopped arguing with what's coming and started deciding how they'll meet it. Part 3. The Cruelest Room. January 19th arrived the way bad days often do, quietly, without any particular announcement, the sky a flat white that couldn't commit to either clouds or sun. Rosalie was up before dawn as usual, but she didn't go straight to the fire. She stood at the window in the dark for a long minute, looking out at the yard where frost had laid itself down over everything overnight, making the familiar landscape look briefly like something else, something she didn't quite recognize. Then she went and built the fire, because that was what the morning required. She had pressed her good dress the night before, dark green wool, nothing fancy, but it fit her well, and she'd let the seams out herself 3 years ago, so it moved right when she moved. She had one good pair of boots with no cracks in the leather. She had the small jet brooch that had been her mother's, which she almost never wore because it felt like saving something for an occasion important enough to deserve it. She pinned it at her collar while she waited for the kettle. She heard Caleb on the stairs and then in the kitchen doorway. He was already dressed, dark jacket, clean shirt, his good hat in his hand. He looked at her brooch without commenting on it, which was more than most people would have done. "We should leave by 6, he said. "I know." She poured 2 cups and set his on the counter. "Eat something first." "I'm not hungry." "Neither am I," she said. "Eat something anyway." He ate something anyway. Toast and an egg she'd already made, standing at the counter the way he did when he was thinking about something other than food. She ate at the table. They didn't talk much, but the silence was the familiar kind now, the kind that didn't ask anything of you. When they were ready to leave, he held the door open. Not with any ceremony, just held it, because she was carrying her coat and her hands were full. She went through, and he followed, and they walked to the wagon in the cold morning air, their breath making small clouds that disappeared immediately, and she thought, whatever happens tonight, I've had this. This ordinary morning, this held door, I've had this much. It felt important to notice that before the rest of it started. The church hall was already lit when they arrived, warm light spilling from the windows into the darkening street. Other wagons were tied up along the block, horses standing patient and indifferent in the cold. Rosalie could hear voices from inside, the particular layered sound of a community gathering, everybody talking over everybody else in a way that sounds like warmth until you're on the outside of it. Caleb helped her down from the wagon, and they walked to the door together. Inside, the hall was set up with long tables covered in cloth, food already laid out along one side, and perhaps 60 people filling the space with varying degrees of holiday goodwill. The moment they walked in, Rosalie felt the room register them. It wasn't dramatic. No conversation stopped. No heads turned in unison. It was subtler than that. A slight adjustment in the energy of the room, like a field of grass reacting to a change in wind direction. Margaret from the general store materialized almost immediately. "Caleb! And Mrs. Ashcroft, so glad you could make it." Her smile was the same one as always, warm at the surface and doing something else entirely underneath. "You look—" She paused just long enough. "You look warm." "It's cold outside," Rosalie said pleasantly. Caleb had already been claimed by a rancher on his left, who wanted to talk about spring grazing rights, and Rosalie let him go because this had always been the reality of it. In social situations, you couldn't hold on to someone else to stay upright. You had to find your own footing. She made her way to the food table and put a few things on a plate she wasn't going to eat, because having something to hold gives your hands a job, and hands with a job are harder to read as nervous. She found a spot near the wall and stood there and observed, which was something she was very good at. She cataloged who talked to who avoided whom, where the power was in the room, and how it moved. She watched Dorothea Crane work the space with the efficiency of someone running a well-rehearsed operation. She watched 3 younger women cluster near the far corner, glancing her way more than once with the particular carelessness of people who want you to know they're talking about you without wanting to be caught at it. She'd been standing there about 20 minutes when Ruth Bellamy approached. Genuinely, Rosalie thought, not on assignment. Ruth was a direct woman in her 40s with red hands and a no-nonsense face that Rosalie found more trustworthy than most of the softer expressions in the room. "Mrs. Ashcroft," Ruth said, "how's the ranch holding through the cold?" "Better than last year, Caleb says." Rosalie set her untouched plate on the edge of the table. "The water lines held. We lost one section of fence, but it was already compromised." Ruth nodded, the nod of a person who understood practical conversation. "Your Southfield. You planning to work it in spring?" "Northfield first. The soil's better suited to what we want to plant." Ruth's eyebrows moved slightly upward. "Caleb's never worked the Northfield." "I know," Rosalie said. "That's why it's a good idea." Ruth made a sound that wasn't quite a laugh, but was in the neighborhood of one. "I like you," she said, with the directness of someone who doesn't say it unless they mean it. "I want you to know that because the next little while might make it look like everybody in this room feels otherwise." Rosalie kept her expression even. "I appreciate the honesty." Ruth looked across the room at Dorothea, who was making her way toward them with 3 women in tow. Margaret, a thin-lipped woman named Harriet Coles, whom Rosalie had seen twice in the general store, and Clara Hobbs, who was trailing slightly behind with the expression of someone who has made a decision they're not fully comfortable with. "Good evening, Ruth," Dorothea said, arriving like weather. "Mrs. Ashcroft, I'm so pleased you're here. We were just hoping to get better acquainted." Ruth Bellamy said, "I'll be just over there," and the way she said it told Rosalie that she wasn't abandoning her. She was positioning herself where she could see without making it a confrontation. Rosalie appreciated the distinction. "Of course," Rosalie said to Dorothea. "What would you like to know?" Dorothea's smile was a masterwork. It contained everything she needed it to contain and nothing else. "Well, you've come quite a long way, haven't you? From Millfield, I believe. Well, it's not much, is it?" "It's where I came from," Rosalie said. Of course. And Caleb certainly needed," Dorothea gestured vaguely, "help. With the ranch. I think we all thought he'd bring someone on as a hand eventually. We didn't quite expect—" Another gesture, this one encompassing Rosalie's general existence. "A wife?" Rosalie said. "Well," Dorothea's smile turned the degree it always turned. "The advertisement was rather unconventional." "It was honest," Rosalie said. "I prefer that." Harriet Coles, who had been holding her silence with visible difficulty, let it go. "It was a practical transaction," she said, "which I suppose is all one could expect given the circumstances." "What circumstances?" Rosalie asked. Harriet blinked. She hadn't expected the question to be returned. "Well," Harriet said, "Caleb's particular history and your situation. It's simply unusual." "Marriage usually is," Rosalie said. Dorothea stepped back in before Harriet could find her footing again. "I do admire your confidence," she said, with the particular emphasis that turns a compliment into an indictment. "A woman in your position, it takes a certain kind of nerve, doesn't it?" "My position," Rosalie repeated. "Living in a town where you weren't exactly—" Dorothea searched for the word with theatrical deliberateness. "Anticipated." "I wasn't anticipated," Rosalie said. "That's accurate. Neither were the winter greens, and they're growing fine." Something flickered in Dorothea's eyes. Not respect, closer to reassessment. And then Clara Hobbs, who had been quiet at the edge of the group, said something that Clara Hobbs should not have said, because Clara Hobbs had 2 glasses of mulled cider in her and had confused that for courage. "Dorothea," Clara said, "I still think we should just—" Clara, Dorothea said, with a sharpness so precise it was almost surgical. Clara stopped. Rosalie looked at Dorothea and understood that this, the pleasantries, the social sparring, the tested edges, was not the actual plan. This was the warm-up. There was something else prepared. She could feel it the way you feel a change in pressure before a storm, not from anything specific, but from the aggregate of small signals that her body had been reading for 31 years. She excused herself and moved away from the group. She found a moment of space near the back of the hall, set her back against the wall, and took 2 slow breaths. All right, she thought. Whatever it is, it's coming. Stand up straight.
Percy.
It came 40 minutes later when the gathering shifted from the general mingling into what Dorothea announced as a little tradition we have, sharing what we're grateful for in our community. People found seats at the long tables. Rosalie ended up between a man she didn't know well and an empty chair, Caleb still somewhere across the room, absorbed into a conversation about a land dispute that had apparently been simmering for 2 years. Dorothea stood at the front and spoke warmly about community and shared history and the value of knowing your neighbors. She was good at it, genuinely good, the kind of speaker who makes you feel included right up until the moment she uses that inclusion against you. Then she said, I think we should welcome our newest community member. Mrs. Ashcroft has joined us this year in rather unique circumstances, and I thought it might be lovely to let her share a few words about herself. Help us all get to know her. Every head in the room turned. It wasn't an invitation. It was an exposure. The particular social maneuver of putting someone on display and framing it as hospitality, so that any objection looks like rudeness from the person objecting. Rosalie felt the heat of all those faces. She felt the silence settle over the room with the weight of expectation and the undercurrent of something meaner than expectation. Anticipation, the kind specific to audiences waiting for someone to fall. She stood up. Because sitting down was also a choice, and not one she was willing to make. Thank you, Dorothea, she said. Her voice came out steady, which required nothing she wanted to admit to. I came from Millfield in October. I married Caleb Ashcroft. We're working the ranch together, and we'll be working the Northfield in spring. She paused. I don't have a lot of history with this town yet, but I plan on staying long enough to make some. She sat down. For 1 second, the room wasn't sure what to do. Then Harriet Coles laughed, not loudly but pointedly, and in the direction of another woman 2 seats away, and the laugh had content. Rosalie knew what the content was. Then Dorothea said with that warm and terrible smile, That's lovely. And tell me before you came to Caleb, what was your life like? Your brother arranged this, didn't he? Gerald Mercer? We happen to know a family from Millfield who knew of the Mercers. They said you were quite the handful. The word handful dropped into the room like something calculated to do damage. A handful. A burden. An inconvenience with a body too large for the space it occupied. She had heard every version of this in every room she'd ever walked into, and Dorothea had found the version designed to resonate in this particular space, with this particular audience, aimed at this particular woman. Rosalie felt the old thing move through her. The familiar, shrinking impulse, the reflex toward apology, the desire to make herself smaller in every way available to her. She felt it move through her and she let it pass, the way you let a wave pass through rather than fighting it, because fighting it just gets you pulled under. She opened her mouth. My brother, she said, is a man who values his own comfort above most things. I imagine whoever knew the Mercer family in Millfield met him. She kept her voice measured. I'm not Gerald, and I didn't come here to discuss Gerald. I came here to eat cold ham and be part of this community, which I plan to do whether the community finds that convenient or not. A few people at the table shifted. A few looked down at their plates. The man beside her said nothing, but she felt him angle slightly in her direction, which might have meant nothing and might have meant something. Harriet Coles leaned toward the woman beside her and said something, low and quick, and the something was accompanied by a look at Rosalie that needed no interpretation. Dorothea spread her hands in that benevolent way. Of course, we're just getting to know you. Then, it's remarkable, really. Caleb was always, well, he could have had his pick after all. He's a respected man, a good-looking man. She let that settle. People were quite surprised by his choice. His choice. Not Rosalie's choice. Caleb's inexplicable choice. The thing he'd done that required explaining. I imagine they were, Rosalie said. I only mean, Dorothea said, the smile never slipping, that Harlan Creek knows Caleb Ashcroft. We know what he had to offer a woman, and we do wonder what exactly he found in this particular arrangement that suited him. She wasn't asking Rosalie what she brought to the marriage. She was asking the room what possible reason a man like Caleb could have had for choosing a woman like this one. She was asking it out loud, in front of 60 people, with a smile on her face. And Rosalie sat with it for one moment, just one, and in that moment she felt every year of her life pressing on her chest, every room, every laugh behind a hand, every chair that was too small, every Gerald, every poor man on every street corner. Every morning she'd woken up knowing the day was going to ask her to justify her own presence in it. She felt all of it, and underneath it, something else, a different kind of pressure, building. She was about to respond when the chair at the end of the table scraped back. Caleb sat down across from her. She didn't know when he'd gotten there. She hadn't seen him cross the room. But he was there now, his hat on the table beside his plate, his gray-green eyes moving from Rosalie's face to Dorothea's with the slowness of someone who has arrived at a situation and is taking the full measure of it before deciding what to do. Dorothea, he said. Caleb, she said, surprised but recovering. We were just welcoming your wife. I heard. His voice was very flat, very even. I heard from across the room, Dorothea adjusted. We were only making conversation. You were making something, he said. Wasn't conversation. A silence fell around their end of the table. The man beside Rosalie had gone very still. Clara Hobbs was staring at the tablecloth. Dorothea's smile didn't leave, but it altered, went from performance to armor. I don't think you understand the spirit of what my wife, Caleb said, and the two words stopped Dorothea mid-sentence. Came here tonight because this is her community, and she has every right to be in it. She came here because she's not the kind of person who hides from what she thinks she might have to face. He was looking at Dorothea, but his voice was carrying, and people at nearby tables had stopped pretending not to listen. And she sat here and took what you were giving out because she's got more patience than I do, and more dignity than most of the people in this room, and I let it go on too long before I got over here. Caleb, Rosalie started. I'm not done, he said. Not to her. He said it quietly, almost privately, but held up a hand. Then he looked back at Dorothea. What exactly did you find wanting in her? Dorothea's eyes cooled. I'm not sure this is the time or the... What did she do wrong? His voice was still even, still without performance, which made it somehow more devastating than anger would have been. She fixed my porch. She worked my land. She negotiated a better deal on a draft mare than I would have gotten by $20. She kept my books and found an error in my projections and didn't make me feel like an idiot about it. He paused. She made cornbread from scratch the night she arrived, when she'd been traveling 4 days and had every right to ask for something for herself. She made cornbread, and she didn't say one word about how tired she was. He let that sit. So I'm asking you, Dorothea, genuinely, what was inadequate about that? The room was completely quiet. Dorothea said nothing. Her smile had finally gone somewhere private. I'll tell you what I think, Caleb said. I think you decided what she was before she got here. I think you decided it from a piece of paper and whatever Gerald Mercer's reputation was worth, which in my experience isn't much. And I think every time she refused to be what you decided, it annoyed you. He looked around the table. Not aggressively, just clearly, making eye contact with Harriet Coles and the woman beside her and Margaret and everyone who had been part of what had happened tonight. I'm not a man who spends much time worrying about other people's opinions. You all know that. But my wife, he stopped. Something moved across his face. A complicated thing that Rosalie watched from across the table with her hands flat on her thighs and her jaw set and something happening in her chest that had no clean name. My wife. He said again, and the words came differently this time, slower, like he was discovering their weight while he carried them, is the best thing that has happened on my ranch in 10 years. Maybe longer. He looked at Rosalie then, directly, without the sideways quality their eye contact usually had, without the careful management, just directly. And I'm sorry I didn't say that sooner and in better company. The room sat with it. Ruth Bellamy, from her position near the wall where she'd been watching the whole operation, picked up her coffee cup and drank from it with the deliberate calm of someone who was not going to let this moment pass without marking it in some way. Clara Hobbs was crying quietly, which she seemed embarrassed about. Dorothea Crane sat with a perfectly composed face and her hands folded on the table and her smile entirely gone, and for the first time since Rosalie had met her, she looked exactly like what she was. A woman who had just had the thing she counted on taken away from her. The thing she counted on was the assumption that Caleb Ashcroft was too removed, too closed, too locked inside himself to defend anyone, that he didn't care, that his silence was a permission slip for everyone else. She had been wrong, and 60 people had watched her be wrong. Rosalie looked at Caleb and said nothing. What she felt was too large for the room, too large for the moment. It needed air and space and the particular privacy of a place where nobody was watching, and she was sitting in a hall with 60 people and a tablecloth and a plate of cold ham she hadn't touched. So she said, "Thank you," quietly, just to him, and he nodded once, and that was it. Mshepti, they left not long after. Not in a hurry, that would have looked like retreat, and neither of them retreated. But with the natural timing of two people who had completed what they came for and didn't need the aftermath. Outside, the night was sharp and clear, every star visible in that January way that seems too many, too bright, like the sky is overcompensating. Rosalie walked beside him to the wagon, and he helped her up and then climbed up himself, and they sat there for a moment before he picked up the reins. "You didn't have to do that," she said. "I know. I was handling it." "You were," he said, "better than I would have." She looked at the stars for a moment. "It's going to make things complicated." "Probably. Dorothea Crane doesn't forget things like that." "No," he agreed. "She doesn't." She turned to look at him, and in the dark his face was hard to read, but she'd spent months learning the geography of it, where the tension lived, where the rare honest things surfaced. Right now it looked like a face that had done something that cost it something and was working out whether the exchange had been worth it. "Caleb," she said, "what you said in there was true," he said, not quickly, not defensively, just flatly, the way he said things when he was most certain of them. She looked at him for a long moment. The cold was working its way through her wool coat. Pearl would be wondering where they were. "All right," she said. He picked up the reins and clicked to the horses, and the wagon started moving, and they rode home through the January dark. And neither of them said anything else, and the silence between them was different from all the silences it had been before, bigger and warmer and full of things that had been said and things that still hadn't been, and the particular aliveness of knowing that the distance between those two categories was finally getting smaller. When they got back to the ranch, Caleb unhitched the horses, and she went in and built up the fire. She was still standing at the stove when he came in from the barn, and she heard him hang up his coat and his hat, and then he came into the kitchen and stood there, and she turned around. They looked at each other in the firelight. "That cake," he said. "Is there any left?" She blinked. Then she almost laughed. "Half of it. In the pie safe." He got 2 plates. She cut 2 pieces. They sat at the table and ate cake at 10 o'clock at night in January, and it was still slightly dense, and neither of them mentioned it, and the fire made the kitchen warm enough that she took off her good jacket and rolled up her sleeves. And outside the stars were still impossibly bright over the flatland, and Pearl made a sound in the barn that this time, from this distance, sounded like something between the two. Part 4. The Cost of Standing Still. The morning after the community dinner, Harlan Creek woke up and started talking. That was the thing about small towns. They didn't need newspapers for the news that actually mattered. By 8 o'clock, the story had moved through the general store, the feed supply, the barber shop, and 3 kitchen tables. By 10, it had acquired details that hadn't been there the night before, the way stories always do when they pass through enough mouths. By noon, what Caleb Ashcroft had said in that church hall had become both more dramatic and more accurate than the original, which was a rare thing for gossip to manage. Rosalie knew none of this until Delbert came back from his daughter's place on Monday and stopped in the yard before even getting down from his wagon. You went to the winter gathering, he said. She was splitting kindling near the barn door. She set the hatchet down. We did. Delbert climbed down slowly, the way a man does when he's been riding and he's not 20 anymore. He tied his horse to the rail and looked at her with that particular expression she'd come to recognize, the one that meant he had information and was deciding how to organize it. Caleb said something, Delbert said, in front of people. He did? About you. Yes. Delbert was quiet for a moment. Then he said, Good, and went into the barn to check on his animals, and that was the entirety of his commentary, which was more than enough. Caleb himself had been different since that night, not dramatically, not in any way that announced itself, but in small, specific ways that Rosalie noticed because she noticed everything. He came to the kitchen table in the morning without waiting to hear if she was up yet. He asked her opinion about the Northfield timeline without her having to raise it first. He looked at her when he spoke to her, directly, without the managed sideways quality, and held it for a beat longer than strictly necessary. She didn't comment on any of it. She just let it be what it was. What it was, she suspected, was a man who had said something true in public and discovered that the world hadn't ended and was now slowly recalibrating what that meant. Mom. The backlash started on Wednesday. She was in the kitchen when she heard the horse in the yard, and something in the sound of it, too deliberate, too purposeful for a casual visit, made her put down what she was doing before she heard the knock. She opened the front door and found a man she recognized as Hector Bellows, who owned the largest spread of grazing land east of Harlan Creek and sat on the town council with the authority of someone who had never been told he didn't belong anywhere. He was a heavy man in his 60s, well-dressed for a ranch call, which told her this wasn't a ranch call. Mrs. Ashcroft. His tone was the tone of someone performing politeness to someone they don't extend it to naturally. Is Caleb available? He's in the south pasture, she said. I can get him if it's important. It is, Hector said. He didn't elaborate. He stood on the porch with his hat in his hands and looked at a point just past her shoulder, as if eye contact with her required more than he was prepared to give. She went and got Caleb. She didn't follow them back to the porch. She went to the kitchen and stayed there because she understood the difference between being present and being intrusive. But she left the window cracked above the sink, and the cold air carried voices. Hector Bellows, measured and careful. You understand that what you said the other night has created a situation. Caleb, flat. I said what needed saying. Hector. There are people in this town, Caleb, people with business connections that affect this ranch, the supply contracts, the grazing agreements, the water rights negotiation you've been trying to get resolved for 2 years. A pause. Dorothea Crane's brother-in-law sits on that water rights committee. Silence. I'm not threatening you, Hector said, not quite convincingly. I'm telling you the landscape. You embarrassed a significant woman in front of this community, and there are people who stand with her, and those people have reach. What do you want from me? Caleb's voice. An acknowledgement, Hector said, that things were said in the heat of a moment, that no offense was intended, something that allows Dorothea to what? Caleb said. To act like it didn't happen, to go back to doing what she was doing. Caleb, she had my wife standing in front of 60 people while she took her apart piece by piece, Caleb said. She did it with a smile. She did it carefully, so it looked like hospitality. And she did it because she decided before my wife ever arrived in this town what kind of woman she was. And she couldn't stand it when the reality didn't cooperate. He paused. You want me to apologize for naming that? Hector's voice went flatter. I want you to consider your interests. I am, Caleb said. That's why I'm done with this conversation. She heard Hector's boots on the porch, and then his horse, and then the sound of him leaving the way people leave when the visit went the opposite of how they planned. She turned from the window and stood in the kitchen for a moment. The kettle on the stove had begun its low initial murmur. She got 2 cups and made tea, and when Caleb came through the back door, his face was the face of a man who had just paid for something and was working out whether he'd gotten what the thing was worth. She put one of the cups on the counter near him. I heard, she said. He picked up the cup. I know. The water rights, she said. That's been unresolved for 2 years? 2.5. She looked at him steadily. If you want to handle it differently, I don't. Caleb, I said I don't. He said it quietly, without heat, and then looked at his tea, and then out the window, and then at her. I said what I said. I meant it. That doesn't change because Hector Bellows owns a lot of grass. She held his gaze for a moment. All right, she said. He drank his tea. She drank hers. Outside the wind pushed at the house with the casual authority of February, and neither of them talked for a few minutes, and the silence was the kind that holds something delicate that neither person wants to break by moving too fast. The pressure on Caleb didn't arrive all at once. It came in increments, the way serious things usually do, small enough that you could almost convince yourself each piece was manageable until you stepped back and looked at what had accumulated. His grain supplier in Harlan Creek suddenly found himself short on the particular variety Caleb had ordered, though he'd had it in stock for months. The farrier who'd been coming to the ranch for 6 years became unavailable for 3 weeks running. A fence repair that shared a property boundary with the Bellows land got complicated by a surveying dispute that had never been a dispute before. Caleb dealt with each piece practically, without complaint. He found a grain supplier in the next county. He drove to get the farrier himself. He got the surveyor's records and documented the boundary with a precision that closed the dispute before it could open. But Rosalie watched it accumulate, and she watched what it cost him. The extra hours, the extra miles, the grinding friction of systems that had previously worked smoothly being made deliberately inconvenient. None of it was illegal. None of it was even formally hostile. It was just the organized exercise of social leverage, the kind that powerful people in small places have been using forever because they know it doesn't leave marks. She thought about it a lot in those February days. She thought about it while she worked, and she thought about it at night, and twice she came close to saying something about it to Caleb, and both times she pulled back, because she knew, as surely as she knew the Northfield soil, that if she gave him the opening he would say it again. He'd said what he meant, and Hector Bellows owning grass didn't change anything. And she believed that. She genuinely believed that about him. But believing it didn't mean she was comfortable watching him pay for it, quietly, without complaint, with the particular stoic dignity of a man who doesn't show you when something is costing him. She started her own quiet operations. She wrote 3 letters, one to a grain supplier she'd researched through the county agricultural records, one to a farrier 2 towns over who came recommended by Warren Henderson, one to a lawyer in the county seat about the water rights history, framed as a general inquiry from a ranching household. She sent them on a Thursday when she went to town for supplies, and she said nothing about it to Caleb. Not because she was keeping secrets, because she needed to know if anything would come of them before she offered him something that might not arrive. The thing she found in the office on the last Saturday of February was not something she was looking for. She had gone in to update the ledger. Caleb had given her full management of the book 6 weeks ago, without ceremony, simply handing her the key to the locked drawer one morning and saying, "You're better at this than me." And that was the end of it. She was entering the February supply records when the pen she was using ran dry, and she went looking in the desk for another and opened the bottom left drawer. There was a tin box in the drawer. She recognized it as the kind used for documents, and she wasn't looking for documents, but the lid wasn't closed properly, and when she picked it up to move it aside to look for a pen, a photograph slipped out and landed face up on the desk. She looked at it for a long moment. It was a photograph of a woman, young, perhaps 25, dark-haired and handsome in a formal way, written on the back in a hand she didn't recognize. Vivian, 1887. She put it back carefully and found her pen in the next drawer and closed both drawers and sat there for a moment with the ledger in front of her. Vivian. She didn't know that name. She'd never heard it in connection with Caleb, though she'd been here long enough now that Harlan Creek had told her most of his history in pieces, the way towns do, casually, incidentally, through the gaps in other conversations. She knew about the ranch being his father's. She knew his mother had died when he was young. She knew there had been something years ago involving a woman, and she knew it was the kind of something that people in this town chose their words around carefully when they talked about Caleb, the way you talk around a piece of ground you know is unstable. She had not tried to find out more. It hadn't been her business. But now she was sitting in the office with a pen and the ledger and the knowledge of a name, and she understood something she hadn't fully assembled before. The room at the end of the hall she'd been told not to enter. The garden kept by hands that weren't his. The seed tin with the round, careful handwriting. The way he'd said "my mother" and then shut the door on it, but it hadn't been his mother's handwriting on that tin. She'd looked at both. She opened the ledger and began entering the February records. Her handwriting was steady. She was very good at continuing to do what needed doing, but she kept coming back to the photograph. The careful way it had been placed in the tin, not discarded, not displayed, preserved, in a drawer, in the way you preserve something you're not done with but don't know what to do with yet. And she thought about what it cost a person to live for years with a wound they'd decided not to examine. How it changed your architecture. How you built walls, and then forgot you'd built them, and then started believing the walls were just your natural shape. She thought about that a lot more than she was going to admit. She was in the barn, checking Pearl's foot. The mare had been moving slightly off her left front for 2 days, and Rosalie wanted to know if it was the shoe or something in the hoof itself, when Caleb came in and she heard him stop behind her. "What's wrong with her?" he asked. "Not sure yet. Might be a stone bruise. She needs a few days off the hard ground." Rosalie set the foot down gently and Pearl lowered her head and exhaled with the monumental patience of horses. "I'll keep her on the soft paddock and check again Thursday." Caleb came to stand beside her and looked at Pearl with the specific attention of a man who trusts animals more than he trusts most people. "She was moving fine last week." "She was hiding it last week," Rosalie said. "They do that." He looked at her. "Animals don't hide pain." "Sure they do," she said, "when they're not sure it's safe to show it." She hadn't meant it to land anywhere particular. It was just a true thing about horses. But she felt the slight shift in him beside her, or a change in the quality of his stillness, and she knew it had landed somewhere anyway. She went back to checking Pearl's hoof rather than looking at him. After a moment, he said, "Rosalie." "The tin in the desk drawer?" His voice was even. "You found it." She stood up and turned around. He was looking at her with that direct look she'd come to know, the one that didn't perform anything, that just looked. "The photograph came out when I moved it," she said. "I put it back." He nodded. His jaw was doing the thing it did when he was working something out internally that he wasn't sure he wanted to move externally. "Vivian Harlow," he said. We were engaged 8 years ago." Rosalie said nothing. She waited. She was from one of the established families in the county, the Harlows. He looked at Pearl's flank, not at Rosalie. "Her parents didn't think much of the Ashcroft Ranch. Not enough land, not enough standing, but she said it didn't matter to her, and I—" He stopped. "I believed her." "What happened?" "She waited until the engagement was formal and official, and the whole county knew about it," he said. "And then she ended it, at a church social, in front of everyone." The words came out flat, as if he'd drained the emotion from them long ago through repetition. "Said she'd had time to consider her position and thought she could do better. Used those words exactly. Thought I could do better." He paused. "Her mother was standing 3 feet away. I think she'd written the speech." Rosalie was quiet for a moment. Pearl shifted her weight and leaned slightly into Rosalie's shoulder, the way she did when she sensed that standing close to this particular human was useful. "So that's what Dorothea was counting on," Rosalie said slowly. "At the gathering, she was counting on you staying quiet because you always stayed quiet. Because the last time you had something and someone used it against you in public, I locked it down," he said. "Everything. Locked it down and kept it locked. Until January 19th. He looked at her. "Until January 19th, he said. She didn't know what to do with the thing moving around in her chest right now, so she did what she always did. She put her hands to something practical. She picked up the brush from the rail and started working it along Pearl's neck, long, slow strokes, the kind that settled the animal and also settled the human doing it. "She didn't deserve you believing her," Rosalie said. "No," he said. "She didn't. And the women who came after Vivian Harlow, the ones in this town who decided you were the cold rancher, the closed man, they built that story on something she broke." She kept brushing, and they never had to answer for that. They just got to use what she left. He was quiet. She could feel him working through it, the way she'd felt him work through things before. Not fast, not dramatically, just thoroughly, The way a person does when they've been careful for so long that even processing something honestly feels like a risk. The water rights lawyer, he said finally. She stopped brushing, looked at him. Letter came this morning, he said, from a C.J. Whitmore county seat. Says he's reviewed the easement history and thinks we have a strong position. He tilted his head slightly. I don't recall contacting a lawyer. She resumed brushing. I wrote 3 letters in February. The grain supplier and the farrier you already know about because they came through. The lawyer I wasn't sure about. You weren't going to tell me? I was going to tell you when there was something worth telling. She looked at him over Pearl's neck. I told you. He stood there for a moment with the specific expression of a man confronting the fact that someone has been quietly solving his problems while he was busy stoically enduring them, and he didn't know whether to be grateful or embarrassed about not having noticed sooner. You didn't need to do that, he said. I know. She put the brush on the rail. I did it because it was the sensible thing to do, and because someone needed to, and I was here. She met his eyes. That's what I do, Caleb. I look at what needs doing, and I do it. You should know that about me by now. I do know it, he said. That's not what I meant. Then what did you mean? He looked at her for a long moment. That direct look, unmanaged, the one she'd learned to hold without looking away, even when it felt like standing in a draft. I meant, he said slowly, that you have been doing things for this ranch, and for me, since the night you arrived. And I haven't... He stopped. I'm not a man who says things easily. I know that. But I should have said... He stopped again. He looked genuinely frustrated with himself. The frustration of someone who knows what they want to express and can't locate the door. Caleb, she said, you stood up in front of 60 people in January and said I was the best thing that had happened to your ranch in 10 years. That was true. I know it was true. She picked up the water bucket and moved it to Pearl's other side. I wasn't asking you to say anything more than that. I was just... She paused, looking for the honest version. I was glad you said it. I still am. He was quiet. And I'm glad you told me about Vivian, she said, not because I needed to know, because you told me anyway. Pearl drank from the bucket with the focused dedication of a horse who has decided this moment calls for water and nothing else. Outside, the February wind did what February wind does in that part of the country, moved through everything without apology. The North Field, Caleb said finally. She looked up. If we're going to turn it in spring, we should start amending the soil now, he said. It's clay heavy, like you said, needs to be worked in early. She recognized this for what it was. Caleb Ashcroft's version of continuing, of moving forward, of taking what had just passed between them and placing it carefully into the ongoing life of the ranch, which was also the ongoing life of what they were building without having formally named it yet. I know, she said. I was thinking we start next week, weather allowing. I can get Delbert on it Monday. I'll work it with him, she said. I want to do it right. He nodded. He picked up his hat from the rail where he'd set it and put it back on, the small ritual of a man returning to the world from somewhere more interior. He was almost to the barn door when he stopped. Rosalie. Yeah. He didn't turn around. He stood there with his back to her and his hand on the barn door frame and said, I wrote to the town council about the water rights, formally, as a property owner. He paused. I also wrote to Bellows. She waited. I told him that the line I drew in January wasn't going anywhere, he said, and that if there were consequences to that, I'd rather know them up front than have them delivered sideways. He pushed the barn door open a few more inches. Thought you should know. She looked at his back, at the set of his shoulders, which she knew now almost as well as she knew her own hands, where the tension lived, where it went when it released. Thank you for telling me, she said. He went out into the February cold, and she stood in the barn with Pearl and the smell of hay and horses and the particular quiet that comes after something significant has been said without either party quite finding the word for what it is. The town council meeting was set for the second week of March, partly to address the water rights easement and partly, though this was not stated in the official notice, because enough had shifted in Harlan Creek's social atmosphere since January that certain arrangements were under pressure. And pressure in a small town eventually requires a room where everyone pretends to address it formally. Rosalie found out about it from Ruth Bellamy, who rode out to the ranch on a Tuesday morning in late February with the directness she applied to everything. "There's a meeting," Ruth said, accepting coffee at the kitchen table. "You know about it?" Caleb mentioned it. "Dorothea's going to be there," Ruth said, "with Hector Bellows and his money and whoever else she's managed to line up. They're going to frame it as a community standards discussion. That's the language they're using. Community standards." Rosalie drank her coffee. "Meaning us. Meaning you," Ruth said without cruelty. "Caleb's been part of this community for 30 years. They can't remove him from that. But they think maybe they can make the argument that the situation has changed since his arrangement." Ruth's eyes were direct and clear. "They're going to try to make the case that you're a disruption." "I fixed his fence and planted his winter greens and organized his books," Rosalie said. "I know that. You know that." Ruth set her cup down. "They're not talking about the fence." Rosalie understood. They were talking about January 19th. They were talking about the fact that Caleb Ashcroft had stood up and said publicly that his mail-order wife was a blessing, and in doing so had made 60 people in that room look at what they'd assumed and find it wanting. You don't do that to a town's self-image without the town finding a way to push back. "Will you come?" Ruth asked. Rosalie looked at her. "To the council meeting?" "Caleb can't go alone," Ruth said. "Not to that room. Not with those people aligned against him." She paused. "And frankly, I think they should have to look at you while they talk about you." Rosalie thought about it for approximately 3 seconds. "Tell me the date," she said. Ruth told her. Then she finished her coffee and stood up and put on her coat and said, "You're going to be all right, you know, both of you." She said it the way she said everything, like a statement of observed fact rather than reassurance, which made it more comforting than reassurance usually was. After she left, Rosalie stood at the kitchen window for a long time, looking out at the yard where the frost was finally starting to thin at the edges, the ground underneath just barely beginning to consider the possibility of spring. Pearl moved in the paddock, slow and patient on her healing foot. Delbert was doing something in the far barn that involved banging, which was just Delbert. She thought about the council meeting. She thought about what it would ask of her, to sit in a room while her own existence was put on trial by people who had decided what she was before she'd ever said a word to any of them, and to sit there without shrinking, and to let them look. She'd done that before. She'd been doing it her whole life. The difference was that this time she wouldn't be doing it alone. She went to find Caleb to tell him Ruth had been there, and she found him at the fence line of the north field, turning the first test patch of the clay-heavy soil with a spade, working it slowly and thoroughly, the way someone does when they have a plan and they're committed to it. And the result might be months away, but the work begins today. She picked up the second spade that was leaning against the fence post. He looked at her. "Two's faster," she said. He moved over to give her room. She drove the spade into the cold ground and turned the first dark clod of clay-heavy earth. And it smelled like something coming awake, like things that had been waiting underground for the right conditions to show themselves. She and Caleb worked the north field in the last week of February, side by side, without much talking, which was exactly enough. Part 5. What the Ground Holds. The night before the council meeting, Rosalie couldn't sleep. She lay in her room and listened to the house settle. The familiar language of old timber and cold air, the creak above the bedroom door that happened every night around 2 a.m. without fail, the distant sound of Pearl shifting in the barn. She had learned this house the way you learn any place you've decided to stay in, not all at once, but gradually, in the dark, in the small hours when the only honest version of a place is the one it makes when it thinks nobody's paying attention. She stared at the ceiling and thought about the council meeting. She thought about Dorothea Crane and Hector Bellows and the particular architecture of what they'd built against her and Caleb. Not dramatic, not loud, but deliberate, the kind of opposition that operates through social pressure and withheld convenience and the slow withdrawal of goodwill that a community can weaponize without ever having to call it what it is. She thought about what she was walking into tomorrow, and she was honest with herself about the fear. Not the showy kind of fear that announces itself in trembling and tears, the quiet kind. The kind that sits in your chest like a held breath and asks you, with genuine curiosity, whether you're actually going to do this. Yes, she told it. We're doing this. She turned onto her side and closed her eyes, and eventually, somewhere around 3 in the morning, slept. Well, she was dressed and in the kitchen before Caleb came down. She'd made oatmeal and coffee and cut the last of the dried apple bread she'd made on Sunday. She heard him on the stairs, and then he was in the doorway, dressed in his good jacket, the dark one he'd worn to the winter gathering, and his face had the look it got when he'd made a decision and was living inside it without second-guessing. He looked at the table and then at her. "You slept?" he asked. "Some," she said. "You?" "Some." He sat down. She poured the coffee. They ate oatmeal in the early morning quiet, and she thought about how unremarkable this looked. 2 people eating breakfast before a hard day, and how much was underneath the unremarkable surface of it, the months of work and silence and careful small gestures, and one very public evening in January that had cracked something open that neither of them had finished walking through yet. "Whatever happens today," she said. "Don't," he said. She looked up. "Don't do the thing where you tell me whatever happens is all right," he said. "I know you mean it to be kind, but I don't want contingency plans this morning." She held his gaze. "I was going to say whatever happens today. I need you to let me speak if I need to speak. Don't manage me in that room." He blinked. A slow blink, the kind that means recalibration. "I wasn't planning to." "Good." She went back to her oatmeal. "Then we're ready." The council hall in Harlan Creek was a low building on the north end of Main Street, stone-faced and practical, built to last rather than to impress. It held about 40 people comfortably, and more than that if they were motivated. By the time Caleb and Rosalie arrived at 6:45, there were already wagons tied along both sides of the street. More people than a water rights dispute typically drew. Ruth Bellamy was waiting outside. She fell into step beside Rosalie without preamble. "Bellows has 3 council votes," she said quietly. "You've got 2 on your side, Emmett Grange and Old Patterson. The swing vote is Thomas Adler, who owns the mill and has no particular allegiance to anyone except his own interests." "What are his interests?" Rosalie asked. "Predictability," Ruth said. "He doesn't like disruption." "Neither do I," Rosalie said. "Disruption found me." Ruth made a sound that was almost a laugh. They went in. The room was full. Not just council members, townspeople, ranchers, merchants, the woman from the feed store, Warren Henderson in the back row looking like a man who had come to observe rather than participate. Delbert was there, which surprised her, standing along the far wall with 2 of Caleb's other ranch hands, Bobby Crane, no relation to Dorothea, something he'd had occasion to specify, and a young man named Ira, who hadn't been with the ranch long but apparently had opinions about where his loyalty sat. Dorothea was in the front row, composed and immaculate, with Harriet Coles beside her and Hector Bellows on the aisle. They didn't turn when Caleb and Rosalie entered, but Rosalie saw Dorothea's shoulders adjust slightly, the almost imperceptible change of a person who has registered what they've been waiting for. They took seats midway back, beside Ruth. Caleb sat on the aisle and Rosalie sat beside him, and she put her hands in her lap and looked at the front of the room and breathed steadily through the noise of everyone settling. Council Chairman Harold Park called the meeting to order at 7 sharp. He was a lean, careful man in his 60s who ran meetings with the efficiency of someone who genuinely had other things he'd rather be doing. He went through the formal items first: road maintenance funding, a property line dispute between 2 farms on the east side, approval of last month's minutes. Then he said, "We have a petition before the council regarding community standards and the Ashcroft water rights easement. Mr. Bellows, you filed this petition. You have the floor." Hector Bellows stood with the confidence of a man who has stood in important rooms many times and found them agreeable. He laid out his argument cleanly and without apparent malice, which was what made it dangerous. The water rights easement was legitimate, he acknowledged that, But the manner in which it had been pursued recently, through outside legal channels and formal letters that bypassed the established community process, suggested that the Ashcroft household was operating in a manner contrary to the cooperative spirit of Harlan Creek. Furthermore, he said, there had been incidents at community gatherings that had caused division and discomfort, and the council should consider whether certain, he paused with surgical precision, arrangements in the community were conducive to the cohesion that a frontier town depended on. He said all of this pleasantly. He sat down. Rosalie felt Caleb's arm alongside hers go slightly rigid, not dramatically, just the small physical manifestation of a man containing something. Chairman Park looked out at the room. Is there a response? Caleb started to stand. Rosalie put her hand briefly on his arm, not stopping him, just a second of contact, and then she stood instead. The room went very quiet. She had thought about what she was going to say. She'd been thinking about it since Ruth's visit, since the sleepless hours last night, since this morning's oatmeal. She had organized it, and then she had taken the organization apart, because organized speeches in moments like this sounded like organized speeches, and that wasn't what this room needed. My name is Rosalie Ashcroft, she said. I came to Harlan Creek in October. I answered a practical advertisement written by a practical man, and I came here because I had run out of places where I was wanted and needed a place where I could be useful. She looked around the room, not aggressively, just clearly, the way she'd watched Caleb do it in January. I want to address what Mr. Bellows actually said, which was courteous on the surface and something else underneath. Hector Bellows shifted. He said the manner in which we pursued the water rights was contrary to the cooperative spirit of this town, she said. The manner we used was legal correspondence and a lawyer, which is what you use when the cooperative spirit of a town has been selectively applied. She paused. The grain supplier who suddenly had no stock, the farrier who was unavailable for 3 weeks, the surveying dispute on a boundary that hadn't been disputed in 20 years. These things happened after January 19th, after my husband said in public that he stood with me. She let that settle. I'd like someone to explain to me how that's cooperative. The room was very still. And as for the incident at the gathering, she said, and her voice stayed even, though what it cost her to keep it that way was her own business. I stood in front of 60 people while a woman who had decided what I was before I ever arrived in this town asked me, with a smile, what possible reason a man like my husband could have had for choosing a woman like me. She looked at Dorothea then, directly. I didn't fall apart. I didn't leave. I answered her, and then my husband answered her, and what he said was true. The disruption that followed was not caused by the truth. It was caused by people who preferred things the way they were when the truth wasn't being said out loud. She heard something in the back of the room, a sound that might have been the beginning of something from Warren Henderson's direction. I'm not asking this council to like me, she said. I'm not asking anyone in this room to have wished things were different. I'm asking this council to look at what is actually being requested here, which is that my husband be penalized for defending me, and that I be considered a disruption for the crime of not being what people decided I was. She looked at Chairman Park. The water rights easement is legitimate. You can check the legal history, and I imagine Mr. Whitmore's letter will cover it thoroughly. The rest of what Mr. Bellows raised is not a legal matter. It's a personal one, and it should be treated as such. She sat down. The room held its breath for about 4 seconds, and then Warren Henderson in the back row said in his old, clear voice, "She's right." It wasn't loud, but it carried. Thomas Adler, the mill owner, who had been watching the whole proceeding with the focused attention of a man calculating something, said, "I'd like to see the easement history before we vote on anything." Hector Bellows said, "Thomas." "It's a reasonable request," Adler said without heat. "If the legal position is sound, there's no argument to be made. And if it isn't, there is." He looked at Chairman Park. "Can we table the water rights question pending review of the Whitmore correspondence?" Park said, "We can." Bellows stood. "The community standards question sits alongside the easement," Park said, "until we have the full picture." He looked out at the room. "Motion to table?" Emmett Grange said, "So moved." Old Patterson said, "Seconded." Adler said, "Aye." It went to a vote, and the vote was 4-2, and Hector Bellows sat down with the expression of a man who had expected a different room. Dorothea Crane said nothing. She sat with her hands folded and her face composed and her eyes on the front wall, and Rosalie looked at her for a moment and felt, not triumph, nothing as clean as that. Something more complicated. The recognition that the woman in the front row had been, at some earlier point in her life, probably wounded in ways she'd never dealt with, and had built a social empire on making sure other people felt what she'd felt first, before she had to feel it again. That didn't make what she'd done excusable. It just made it human. Rosalie looked away. Outside the hall afterward, the night air was sharp and smelled like early spring. That particular smell of ground that is beginning to mean something again after months of cold. People came out in groups, and the conversation on the street had a different quality than it had gone in with. The quality of a room where something has shifted and everyone is adjusting to the new positions. Ruth Bellamy appeared at Rosalie's elbow. "Adler's going to review the easement," she said quietly. "He's thorough. If Whitmore's letter is solid—" "It's solid," Rosalie said. Ruth nodded. "Then it's done." Warren Henderson made his way over, moving with the careful economy of a man who has learned not to waste steps. He looked at Rosalie and said, "You've got a good argument." "The argument is the truth," she said. "In my experience," Warren said, "those aren't always the same thing. Tonight they were." He nodded once. "Pearl's foot healing up all right?" "Another week and she'll be fine," Rosalie said. He nodded again and moved on, and she watched him go and thought about what Ruth had said. In my experience, those aren't always the same thing, and about all the rooms she'd been in where the truth of what she was hadn't been the argument that won, and about what it felt like tonight to have those two things align. She felt Caleb beside her. He'd been talking to Emmett Grange, and now he was standing next to her with his hat in his hands and the cold air moving through his hair, and he was looking at her with the expression she'd come to know as his honest one, the one that didn't manage anything. "You didn't need me in there," he said. "That's not true," she said. "I needed you in there. I just also needed to speak for myself." He considered that. "Fair," he said. She looked at him, at the set of his jaw and the gray-green of his eyes in the dark, and the way he held his hat. Careful with it, the habit of a man who grew up being told that things worn out couldn't be replaced. "Caleb," she said, "I want to say something, and I want you to let me say it without deflecting." He went very still. "All right." "What you've done since January," she said. "The stance you've taken, with Bellows and the suppliers and all of it. I know what it's cost. I know the water rights and the grazing agreements and the grain. I know those things matter to this ranch. And you took all of that on rather than give them what they wanted, which was an apology that would have undone what you said." She held his gaze. "Nobody has done that for me before. Stood in that kind of wind and stayed standing." She paused. "I wanted you to know I understand what that is." Something moved across his face. The complicated things she'd seen before, but clearer now, less managed. "It wasn't a difficult decision," he said. "It was an expensive one." "Those aren't the same thing either," he said quietly. She looked at him for a moment longer. The street was still full of people, voices moving around them, wagons starting to pull out. Not the right place for everything that might be said. Some things needed a kitchen and a fire and 2 cups of something hot and the particular privacy of their own 4 walls. "Let's go home," she said. He put his hat back on. "Yeah," he said. "Let's go home." March moved through the county like a man who can't make up his mind. Cold mornings, warm afternoons, a week of rain that made the newly turned north field run with water, and concerned Rosalie enough that she went out in her boots and her old coat and stood in the mud looking at the drainage pattern for 20 minutes until she was satisfied it was moving the right direction. She and Caleb worked the field through March with Delbert and Ira and sometimes Bobby, who turned out to have an unexpected gift for knowing what the soil needed, developed from a childhood on his grandmother's vegetable farm in the next county. They amended and turned and amended again, and Rosalie planned the planting rotation on paper and then revised it twice and then argued about it productively with Caleb on a Tuesday evening over supper, until they arrived at a version neither of them had started with, which was how she'd come to understand that good decisions usually got made. C.J. Whitmore's review of the water rights easement came back in the second week of March. The legal position was exactly as solid as Whitmore had indicated. Thomas Adler brought it before a brief council session, and the easement was formally recognized without further contest. Hector Bellows was not present at that session, which told its own story. The grain supplier arrangement with the county-over merchant proved to be better than the old arrangement, 10% cheaper on the primary varieties and more reliable delivery, since the new merchant ran his operation with the organized efficiency of someone who understood that a reputation for dependability was worth more than a short-term markup. Caleb told Rosalie this with the expression of a man who has noticed that a problem solving itself is still a solution. "You're welcome," she said. "I didn't say anything," he said. "I know," she said. "I'm saying you're welcome anyway." He gave her a look. She gave it back, and the corner of his mouth moved in that way it moved, which she had long since stopped pretending she didn't watch for. Bammed. The letter from Gerald arrived on a Thursday in late March. She recognized the handwriting on the envelope and set it on the table and looked at it for a while before she opened it. Gerald wrote the way he did everything, with an economy of feeling that dressed itself up as reasonableness. He had heard she was doing well, he said. He was glad of it. He found himself in some financial difficulty and had been wondering if, now that she was settled, she folded the letter and put it back in the envelope. She sat at the kitchen table in the afternoon light and thought about Gerald. Not with anger. She was too tired of the weight of that anger to carry it today. She thought about him with the particular flatness of someone who has finally, after a very long time, stopped expecting a person to be different than they are. Gerald was Gerald. He had never been going to be different. Waiting for him to be different had cost her years of the wrong kind of effort. She got a piece of paper and wrote back. It was short. She told him she was well. She told him she couldn't help with financial matters. She told him she hoped he found his footing. She signed it, Rosalie Ashcroft, the name she'd used for the first time on that first day in the general store. Strange in her mouth then, and now just hers, the way anything becomes yours when you've lived in it long enough. She sealed the envelope and put it in her coat pocket to mail in town. Caleb came in from the field while she was still at the table and looked at the coat pocket where the letter was, and then at her face. And he didn't ask because he'd learned when questions were needed and when they weren't. "Gerald," she said. He sat down across from her. "Wanting money?" "As always." "You responded?" Told him no. She looked at the table. "It's strange. I thought it would feel like more, saying no to him. I used to spend so much energy trying to figure out how to manage him, how to make him see me differently, how to be the kind of person he'd be glad he kept around." She shook her head. "Now I just wrote 3 sentences and sealed it up, and I feel nothing remarkable. Just done with it." Caleb was quiet for a moment. "That's not nothing," he said. "That's what done actually feels like. People think done feels like winning. It doesn't. Just feels like quiet." She looked at him. "You sound like you know." "Vivian," he said, "there was a period where I thought about it a lot. Thought about what I should have seen, what I should have said differently, whether I should have—" He shook his head. "One day I woke up and realized I'd stopped thinking about it sometime in the middle of the previous week, and I hadn't noticed when it happened. Just quiet." He paused. That was the actual end of it. She held his gaze. "When was that?" He thought about it. "November," he said, and then, as if hearing what he'd said, "Last November." Last November, 2 months after she'd arrived. Neither of them said anything about that, but it was there in the room between them, sitting with the afternoon light on the kitchen table, plain and quiet and undeniable. The planting began in the first week of April. The North Field, amended and turned and allowed to drain through March, received its first seed on a Tuesday morning when the temperature had made a commitment to warmth that felt real rather than provisional. Rosalie walked the rows with the seed bag, and Caleb came behind with the press wheel, and Delbert covered the western section, and Ira and Bobby worked the edges, and by the end of the first day, half the field was in. It was hard work. Her back ached by midday, and her hands were raw by afternoon. She didn't mention either thing. She drank water from the canteen and kept going, because the field was in front of her and the seeds were in her hands, and the soil under her boots was the soil she'd spent months preparing. And sometimes the most satisfying work is the work that finally arrives after all the work that made it possible. That evening, she and Caleb sat on the porch, something they'd started doing in late February when the evenings began to soften slightly, sitting with coffee and looking out at the land in the particular peaceable way of people who are tired from something good. The stars were coming up, and the air smelled like turned earth, and somewhere in the distance, coyotes were running, their voices cutting across the dark in that sound that used to make her uneasy and now just meant she was somewhere real and open and alive. "Northfield looks right," Caleb said. "It does," she said. She wrapped both hands around her coffee cup. "Another week and we'll have the whole thing in." He nodded. He looked out at the land. "I've been thinking," he said. She waited. "The ranch," he said. "The records. The operation." He paused. "I want to change the account at the bank. Put both names on it." She looked at him. "You've been running these books for months," he said, not looking at her yet, looking at the dark field. "You negotiated the grain, organized the lawyer, planned the planting rotation. Half the decisions that kept this place going this winter were yours." He turned then. "It should say that somewhere official." She held his gaze. "That's not a small thing," she said. "No," he agreed. "You're sure?" "I wouldn't have said it if I wasn't." She looked at him for a long moment. She thought about the woman on the stagecoach in October, holding the leather strap above the window so she wouldn't slide off the bench, looking out at this town and feeling the particular tired that lives below the bones. She thought about the kitchen on that first night and the cornbread she'd made because she didn't know what else to do but keep her hands busy. She thought about the porch railing and the winter greens and Pearl's healing foot and the tin in the desk drawer with the photograph inside it and a name written on the back, and what it meant that a man who had locked everything down after a public wound had stood up in a room full of people and said her name like it meant something. "All right," she said. He nodded. He turned back to the field. They sat on the porch until the cold came in enough to move them inside, and then they went in and she made tea and he banked the fire and they moved around the kitchen in that comfortable parallel way they'd developed over months. Not choreographed, not effortful, just two people who had learned each other's patterns and stopped needing to announce their movements. She was washing the cups when he said, behind her, "Rosalie." She turned around. He was standing in the middle of the kitchen with his hands at his sides and the firelight doing something warm to the angles of his face, and he looked like a man who has organized his courage and is about to use it before it relocates. "I'm not a man who says things easily," he said. "You know that." "I know that. But I've been thinking about what you said in the barn, about what I've done since January and what it cost." He stopped. "It didn't cost me anything I wanted to keep." He held her gaze. "I want to be clear about that." She set the cup down on the counter. "What are you saying, Caleb?" "I'm saying—" He stopped again. He looked briefly frustrated with himself, that specific frustration of a precise man who has run out of the precise language he depends on. Then, "I'm saying that this started as an arrangement, that I was very clear about that, and I meant it to stay that way. And somewhere in the middle of a cold winter and a bad gathering and a north field full of clay soil, it stopped being an arrangement and I didn't notice exactly when, which is probably something I should have said before now." She was very still. "I'm not asking you to feel a particular way about it," he said. "I know what I offered you, and I know what that was. I'm just telling you what's true, because you once told me you prefer honest to dressed up, and I—" He stopped. "I find I can't dress it up anymore." The kitchen was very quiet. The fire popped once and settled. "Caleb Ashcroft," she said. "Yeah. You're telling me you love me." He held her gaze with that direct look, the one she'd learned over months, the one that didn't manage anything. "Yes," he said. "That's what I'm telling you." She crossed the kitchen. She stood in front of him close enough that she had to look up slightly to meet his eyes, and she said, "I've been in love with you since Christmas. Since that bowl of oversalted beans." He blinked. "That was December." "Yes, it was." "You've known since December." "I've known since December," she confirmed. He looked at her with an expression she'd never quite seen on him before. Not the complicated thing, not the managed thing, just something direct and unguarded and slightly undone. Why didn't you? Because you weren't ready, she said. And I wasn't going to push a door that wasn't ready to open. I can be patient. She paused. I planted winter greens in frozen ground and waited 3 weeks. He stared at her. They grew, she said. And then, without ceremony, without anything that required announcing, he put his arms around her and she let him, and they stood in the kitchen in the firelight with the cold March night pressed against the windows. And it was clumsy and real and not remotely smooth, and she pressed her face against his shoulder and breathed out something she'd been holding so long she hadn't noticed the weight of it until it was gone. Spring came to the Ashcroft Ranch in ways that were practical and busy, and did not leave much room for sentimentality, which suited both of them. The North Field came up in the second week of May. First the tentative green thread of new growth along the rows, then the confident push of it as the days warmed and the light lengthened. Rosalie walked the field every morning and checked the rows and made notes and came back to the kitchen and told Caleb what she'd found. And he listened with the specific attention of a man who has learned that listening to this particular person is worth his full capacity. The water rights were formally resolved in May. C.J. Whitmore filed the final documentation, and the easement was recorded properly, and the water came to the Ashcroft land with the bureaucratic finality of something that had always been true being officially acknowledged. Caleb told Hector Bellows, by letter, that he considered the matter closed and bore no ill will, and hoped the same was true in return. Bellows did not respond, which was its own kind of response, and Caleb accepted it with the equanimity of a man who has stopped needing people to be different than they are. Dorothea Crane did not come to the ranch, and Rosalie did not go to her. They existed in the same small town the way that people who have reached an impasse sometimes do. Not enemies exactly, not friends certainly, just two women who had looked at each other in a room and understood exactly what the other was made of. Rosalie had come to a kind of peace with that. She didn't need Dorothea's good opinion. She'd never needed it. What she'd needed was to stand in the room without flinching, and she had done that. Clara Hobbs, who had cried quietly at the winter gathering, stopped by the ranch in April with a jar of preserved peaches, and an apology that was awkward and sincere in approximately equal measure. Rosalie accepted both. She made Clara tea, and they sat at the kitchen table, and Clara told her, haltingly, that she had known what Dorothea was planning that night, and had tried to object, and had been overruled, and that she should have tried harder, and she was sorry. Rosalie thought about what it cost Clara to come out here and say this to a woman she barely knew, and she thought it cost more than most people would have paid. "You came," Rosalie said. "That counts." Clara went home with an easier expression than she'd arrived with. Not absolved. Rosalie wasn't in the business of absolution, but at least unburdened of a thing she'd been carrying. Ruth Bellamy became the closest thing to a friend Rosalie had in Harlan Creek, which suited both of them, because neither was a woman who needed more than one person who genuinely meant what they said to them. They rode together sometimes in the mornings, Ruth on her bay gelding and Rosalie on Pearl, whose foot had healed completely and who moved with the unhurried confidence of an animal that knows its own worth. They talked about crops and cattle and the particular absurdities of living in a small community where everyone knew everything and remembered it longer than was useful. They did not talk about feelings, which was part of why the friendship worked. The old mail-order advertisement, the original one Caleb had placed, the single printed sheet that Rosalie had found folded in the ranch office files in February, the one that had started all of it. Caleb burned it on an evening in late May. Not with ceremony. He just found it in the file while he was reorganizing and stood at the stove and fed it in, and Rosalie was at the table with the ledger and saw him do it and didn't say anything for a moment. Then she said, "Was that what I think it was?" "Yeah," he said. She looked at him. He looked at her. "You kept it," she said. "I'm not a man who throws things away," he said. "I'm also not a man who needs to keep everything." He closed the stove door. "Some things you keep until they're finished. Then you let them go." She nodded. She went back to the ledger. "Some things you keep until they're finished. Then you let them go." She wrote that in the small notebook she kept on the nightstand later that night, because she had the habit of writing down things that were true in language simple enough to actually use. She had a lot of things in that notebook now. Observations, notes about soil composition, reminders to herself about which animals preferred which kind of handling, occasionally something a person had said that deserved to be kept. She kept the notebook on the nightstand and she added to it when things occurred to her worth adding. She had, it turned out, a great deal worth adding. Quote, "The North Field came into its first real yield in late June, better than projected, 35% above what the South Field had produced the same season, which was what the soil had in it once someone took the time to understand what it needed rather than dismissing it as too difficult to bother with." Caleb walked the field with her the evening they took the first full count of it, the two of them moving between the rows in the long summer light with the particular satisfaction of people who put something into the ground and waited, and then found that the waiting was worth it. 35%, he said. "I said 30, she said. "I was conservative." "You were right about the Clay Amendment." "I was right about most things," she said, without smugness, just as a matter of record. He looked at her sideways. "You were." She stopped walking and looked out at the field, at all of it, the long rows, the good green of it, the sky above the flat land going amber at the edges the way it did in the summer evenings out here, enormous and ordinary and beautiful in the way that things are beautiful when they're just themselves without trying to be anything else. She thought about October, about the stagecoach and the dust and the 6-inch space on the wagon seat, about the kitchen on the first night and the cornbread and the man who sat across from her and said, "You can cook," like it surprised him. She thought about all the rooms she'd walked into knowing the room had already decided, and all the times she'd walked out undamaged anyway, and the one room in January where something had happened that she hadn't expected. Not rescue, not deliverance, just a man standing beside her and saying what was true, in public, without apology. She thought about what it takes to become someone's home. It doesn't happen in a single moment. It happens in October and December and February and May. It happens in oatmeal and arguments about planting rotations and a photograph in a tin box and a bowl of oversalted beans. It happens slowly, and then it has happened, and you look up one summer evening in a north field and find yourself standing in the middle of a life you didn't think you were allowed to want. "Caleb," she said. "Yeah. I want to do the East Field next year." He looked at the East Field, which was currently nothing but scrub and hard ground and potential. He looked at it for a long moment with the expression of a man calculating what a thing will cost against what it might be worth. "That's more ambitious," he said. I know. It'll take most of the winter to prepare." "I know." He was quiet for a moment. The amber light moved across the field and across his face and across the long rows of everything they'd grown. "All right," he said. She nodded. They stood together in the north field in the summer evening, and the ground under their feet held everything they'd put into it, and the sky above them held the last of the light, and neither of them said anything else for a while because sometimes the true things don't need to be said. They're just there, solid and plain and permanent, like good fences and honest soil and the particular kind of person who stays.